You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at East-West diplomacy. It's been a busy few days for Russia's recently inaugurated President Vladimir Putin, including meetings with European and Chinese leaders. Syria has topped the agenda, with Beijing and Moscow resisting Western efforts to hasten the end of President Bashar al-Assad. While Russia and China see eye to eye on Western-led intervention in Syria, they still remain something of a diplomatic odd couple. Moscow is hardly unaware of the growing military and economic powerhouse that is expanding its business interests into Siberia. Talks with European Union members in St. Petersburg earlier this week also displayed tensions with Russia's biggest trade partner. Putin pushed the idea of a Eurasian Union, an economic and political alliance of Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan and other former Soviet republics. He resisted European calls for improving human rights in Russia, while also sparring over gas deals and visa-free travel for Russians to the EU. So, what kind of foreign policy is Putin carving out for the Russian Federation? How will the split between East and West on Syria play out? And what have we learned about Moscow's relations with the EU and China? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by John Lough from the Foreign Policy Institute, Chatham House, Victor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Jana Kobzova from a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Natalia Karpova from the Higher School of Economics, over the line from Moscow. Turning to you, first of all, John Lough from Chatham House. In your opinion, what's the key development from Putin's talks with European and Chinese leaders this week?
Well, I think if there's any key development, and I hesitate to say there is one, it's the fact that we've seen no progress at all on Syria. The EU and Russia appear to have had a polite, business-like meeting. The differences in the relationship are certainly visible, and these are around visas, certain frictions, as you mentioned, around Russia's energy relationship with Europe. But both sides appear committed to finding a way forward, to talking further, to developing a new agreement between them. So Putin then travelled on to, he'd already visited Paris and Berlin. He then travelled on to Beijing. And again, with the Chinese, I think nothing spectacular has emerged. Russia and Syria seem determined to keep aligned positions on Syria. And this is of considerable concern to the main Western powers, because this crisis is clearly escalating. And despite this outward commitment to the Kofi Annan plan on all sides, there is a very fundamental difference on what to do with President Assad personally and his regime. So what I think is interesting in the Chinese case is that this is becoming an increasingly important relationship for Russia, a difficult one to manage because of the asymmetries, particularly economic asymmetries. Russia's, I think, long-term fears about how to sustain its presence in the Far East of Russia, East Siberia in the Far East, and to develop the economy. And the sides, on the surface, have a warm relationship, but analysts on both the Russian and Chinese sides are both convinced that this positive rhetoric, in fact, papers over very considerable mutual distrust. So that continues, I think symbolised perhaps by the failure so far, despite talk over going back 6 years, to agree a major deal to deliver Russian pipeline gas to China. That was promised in 2006 by Putin at one of the summits of the Chinese, and so far it has not materialized. In fact, they're still talking about it, and they're still divided on price. And I think that's an interesting indicator, in fact, of the overall condition of the relationship.
Maybe I'll throw that one over to you, Victor. What's the big news you think this week?
I guess the main news of this week would be the summary of the European summit, and the main news is that there are no any news. The reason for it is a long-standing dialogue between Russian Federation and European Union, and to my personal opinion is that Russian Federation is just putting down on the table some unachievable demands. If we talk about the dialogue on free visa travel of Russian citizens to the European states, there were lots of talks about it, and even in I think it was in 2010 when Mr. Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said that within 1 year Russians will achieve this and the Russian citizens will start traveling to Europe without visas. Many specialists say that this idea exists just in the dreams of the side of the Russian delegation. There is a long-standing dialogue going between Europe and Russia, and I think it's very difficult for both of them, for both of the sides, to find common grounds, especially now with the trip of Mr. Putin to China. I mean, we've seen a lot of synergy between Chinese and Russian foreign policy. That's talking about the Libyan case and also talking about the Syrian case. And with finding common goals and common grounds between Russia and Chinese on the foreign stage, I think Putin will be putting more attention and more effort on developing foreign policy towards the East rather than to the West.
And Jana, no movement on Syria, little common ground between Russia and the EU. Is that how you see it?
This has been a typical EU-Russia summit where you have so many issues on agenda where we need progress. Be it trade talks, be it energy partnership, visas, you name it. So you have lots of things that you have to talk about. At the same time, there's no result whatsoever. And that has been the case for past number of years. I think the change is gradually on the EU side where the Europeans started to expect much less from these summits. And I think the fact that both Putin's visit to Berlin and Paris, but also the EU summit, one of the main points was Syria and Iran, is the fact it's funny, these are the two most important trade partners, energy partners, people-to-people contacts is one of the most important countries. Russia is very important for the EU. The fact they talk about foreign policy says a lot about the sort of agenda they're having, which is basically that most of the issues they can't just agree about, so they talk about foreign policy. And it's funny that they talk about Syria because that's where they have a fundamentally different position when it comes to what should be done about Syria and what should be done about stopping the de facto civil war that's happening in Syria.
Natalia, maybe I can put that one over to you in Moscow. What's the view from Russia?
Russia, in name of President Putin, now try to stress their priorities in political and economic cooperation. It's quite clear that European Union and China are the most important strategic partners for Russia. And the typical agenda, which was again fixed during the summit in St. Petersburg, and now it's fixed and developed in his visit to China. What is important for me as an expert and Russian citizen is focus on modernization. Both strategic partners, European Union and China, underlined their readiness to be in cooperation and in close cooperation in Russia on the way of modernization. It is important in my mind, both to Russia and Europe, in order to cope with those very sharp problems we have on the European continent. And in my mind, it's not only the problem of the Russian modernization, it's a problem of very serious revision of economic theory and practice and applied project worldwide. And China, in this context, gives us a lot of interesting experiences and somehow best practices, and it's becoming more and more visible player on international market. Do not forget that China is now on the top of the list of the countries by foreign exchange reserves. It is the biggest potential investor worldwide. And that's why Russia could not ignore the opportunity to develop in depth their cooperation with China. It's not only the point of Siberia and Far East, but it's a point of modernization which really necessary to be developed both in European Union, in Russia, and in China is a great priority, and I think that visits, talks, and discussions during the last days just proved that all the governments and leaders clearly see this perspective worldwide.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at East-West diplomacy. I'm joined by John Lough from the Foreign Policy Institute Chatham House, Victor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Jana Kobzova from a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Natalia Karpova from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. John, the first thing that you mentioned was Syria. After 15 months of bloodshed, the forces of President Bashar al-Assad are understood to have killed more than 9,000 people in the uprising against his rule. More recently, there's been the massacre in Hula, which left more than 100 people dead, men, women and children. It seems that the United States and European Union members keep on thinking that Russia and China are going to budge on this. But what we've seen from the meetings between Putin and his Chinese counterparts is they're not going to budge, are they?
I think that's absolutely correct. Unfortunately, at the moment, there seems no likelihood of some major shift here on Syria. Russia seems to have made the calculation that there's a greater chance that Assad can weather the storm and remain in control than others think. I personally think this is a very risky strategy on their part. And in some ways, I'm very much reminded of what happened to President Milosevic of Yugoslavia back in 1999, when you recall that the Western Russia had an enormous fight over policy towards Kosovo. And Russian policy at that stage was so focused on preventing NATO using force that Milosevic concluded, and probably correctly in the circumstances, that if that was the case, then he had more freedom of action. And so he escalated his policies of ethnic cleansing, which then led to exactly the outcome Russia wished to avoid, which was the use of force by NATO to bring Serbia to heel. Now, the question is, are we going down a similar route here where, in fact, Assad feels that the international community remains divided, that he's going to continue to retain forms of support from certain countries, including Russia in this case. I believe that Russian arms supplies are still reaching the regime. So what is this situation then going to trigger? It's almost certainly going to trigger some arming of the opposition. I see absolutely no grounds or possibility for any form of Western intervention at this stage. But I think there are going to be increasing calls, as there were in Bosnia many years ago, for a levelling of the playing field.
Now, you talk about it in terms of being a strategy, that Moscow is making some kind of calculation here. You do say it's a bad strategy, but what are the ingredients to this strategy? You mentioned the arms sales. Is it just that Russia makes £350 million from arms sales to Syria every year? Is it just the military bases and the Soviet-era relationship? What's the game plan?
There's no single reason. It's not just because the Russians are worried about the future arms sales or their position in Syria if Assad leaves or when he leaves. I think it actually comes down to something more fundamental. Those are all factors. But for me, the crucial factor is that Russia wishes to retain a multipolar world. It wants to prevent the West monopolizing policy towards key regions, in this case, the Middle East. Russia feels it was badly treated over Libya, and to some extent they would claim they were deceived through Western policy, and they seem to have drawn a line in the sand. So this has become a point of principle in international relations. So their commitment to preventing foreign intervention, to channeling everything through the UN, to making sure they have effectively a power of veto, this is extremely important to them, and they're pursuing this policy.
Moscow, of course, says something different. It says that any kind of foreign intervention is going to make the situation in Syria worse, that it will speed up the country's breakup into some kind of sectarian bloodshed. Victor, which side do you agree with?
I would like to start from the fact that Mr. Lavrov, there was a big shift in the Russian policy, to my opinion, which took place in St. Petersburg during the European-Russian summit. And that shift was in a hint that Mr. Lavrov said that they can contemplate the time when Syria will be without Assad. And he agreed that there is a possibility that the way out of the Syrian crisis is getting rid of the top man. So I think Russia will be going the same path as they went, when the crisis was in Libya and in the previous times during Iraq-American wars. And when it comes to the side where the Western countries should start the military invasion or at least air support of the Syrian rebels which are fighting now, or whether they should refrain from that and support them just, let's say, verbally and politically, I would imagine that any military intervention, especially in such a sensitive area like Middle East with Israel on one side and Iran being on the other side, is very risky. I don't think it's very wise of the Syrian government to rely on the Russian support in the future month when they'll be facing NATO planes.
Jana, do you think there's a possibility that's true, that Moscow is moving away from total support to Assad and it could be willing to let him hang?
I actually don't think Russia has a strategy on Syria. I think they have a tactics. And the tactics is they don't see an alternative to Assad. It's not that they love Assad. They just want someone who's going to keep the armed contract, who's going to keep the naval basing point in Syria that they have, who's going to be as friendly as Assad was to Moscow, and that's what they want. They don't see anyone taking on that role now. They see that Assad is still their best bet. At the same time, they also know that there's just no chance that West is going to repeat the intervention they did in Libya. And that's the other thing, that they feel pretty safe at the moment because for them, the choice is basically either Assad or civil war. There's nothing else at the moment. They don't see, NATO planes flying over Syria as they did in Libya. And that's why they're sticking to what they have at the moment.
To my opinion, the main goal here of the Moscow policy will be actually keeping Assad in power. That's what we've seen during the first Iraq invasion in the 1990s when Soviet Union, I think, was still there, and Mr. Gorbachev did everything to keep Saddam Hussein in place and to avoid any American invasion of Iraq, which happened some years later. And then the same thing happened with Mr. Gaddafi. He Today we are seeing Mr. Assad being in the same shoes. I mean, we have to look at all those leaders and consider that all these leaders were created by the Soviet system, or at least if they were not created by Soviet system, they were supported by them. They are the people which were bred by Soviets in 70s and 80s. So now there is some kind of a sense of responsibility, I guess, in Moscow, which is still present. And that's why their main goal in foreign policy in Middle East is to make sure that these leaders stay in power as long as possible and that the transition will be very gradual.
Natalia, what's your view on this one? Is it fair to say that Moscow's position on Syria is purely strategic, purely tactical, and isn't, as it claims, about minimizing civilian deaths?
In my mind, that is strategic position of the modern Russia, to keep the balance of interest in a proportion to mutual interest of the biggest players on the political arena of the world. So Russia somehow tries to avoid any kind of dominance in world politics. In this case, it tries to stop unpleasant trends like we have in Arabian countries, and this trend, I think, looks quite questionable and not good for the world economy and political situation. And what would be good in this case, which was underlined by the Minister of Foreign Affairs quite recently, by Mr. Lavrov, to have a meeting of all interested partners of the conflict and just to put on table their positions and to have quite transparent and clear dialogue what is happening in this country, and try to use United Nations as a supervisor and the leading force to making some decisions on the conflicts in Arabian area.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at East-West diplomacy. I'm joined by John Lough from the Foreign Policy Institute Chatham House, Victor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Jana Kobzova from a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the line from Moscow by Natalia Karpova from the Higher School of Economics. John Lough from Chatham House, when you were talking at the beginning about China and the meetings that have been going on there, you seemed to suggest that there were two things going on. We're hearing about developments, improvements in the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, a state-run fund to invest in joint projects between the two countries, a gas pipeline to carry Russian gas to China, even military operations being expanded between the two countries. You've also talked about a certain uneasiness in the relationship there, concern about Chinese influence in Siberia, for example. How do you view what's going on there?
I think the key point here is that the Chinese economy is continuing to grow fast. China is acquiring political and military weight, and it is gradually becoming a somewhat different actor. Russia, in these circumstances, has a huge task on its hands to manage this relationship, and I believe that it's not going to be able to do it on its own. And then you have the question of whether it needs a relationship with Western allies or other allies to do so. You just have to look at, and I don't want to exaggerate this point, but the demographic trends are clear. And they are very stark in the far east of Russia and East Siberia. Although the federal government has been ploughing huge amounts of money into certain infrastructure projects in parts of the Far East, this region is not developing as fast as it should, and it is organically starting to trade, obviously, much more with China, and is becoming a source of concern to Moscow because it's developing in a different way from probably what Moscow had expected or indeed wanted to see. So I see an effort on Moscow's part to reassert itself, to make sure, as far as it can, that this relationship with China develops in a stable and predictable fashion. The ability to build international alliances here to counterbalance US and Western power, of course, is very convenient to both sides. But that, as I said, I think masks some of the deeper underlying difficulties where Russia is obviously concerned about where this future growth of China is going to lead, where I think the Chinese on their side have concerns about the sustainability of this model in Russia, and wonder when some of these key projects really are going to come to fruition, particularly in the energy sphere.
Victor, turning to you, John raises some interesting issues there about concern from Moscow about the relationship with China. For example, recently they created for the first time a Minister for Far East Development. They've been moving a small number of Russian-speaking families to the Far East. Also, this year, of course, pouring much money into the eastern port city of Vladivostok, billion-dollar bridge projects and so on, ahead of September's Asia-Pacific APEC summit. What do you see as developing in the relationship between Moscow and Beijing?
The Eastern policy of Kremlin is a big concern for the people in Kremlin themselves. And the reason for that is because many of Russians spoke loud about problems the Russian government might start facing in Far East in a few decades. I mean, starting from even Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was sitting in prison, who wrote about the Chinese threat. I think that was already 5 or 4 years ago. Russian media is full of scary figures saying that for every Russian citizen on the northern side of the Russian-Chinese border, there are 300 Chinese on the southern side of the Sino-Russo border. So there are lots of threats. Basically, they come from demographic side, that there are lots of Chinese crossing the border and becoming cheap labor on the Russian labor market. And then there are concerns on the economical side. The fact that Chinese economy has been booming for the last 10 years and Russian economy in the Far East has been struggling due to many factors, due to corruption and poor management and so on. And of course, there is also a strategical, geopolitical factor. And for the last half a year, we've been hearing from Washington so many statements about the new geopolitical approach in the Pacific Ocean. And America will be giving more attention to the Pacific region versus to the Atlantic region. And China is also bringing their own concerns because of that. And here comes Russia. If Russian ministers sit down, they have a lot of ways how they can build up their foreign policy in the near future.
Okay, Jana, China is obviously, as Victor says, growing. America has done its famous tilting, repositioning of its foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific. I've got a comment here from Dmitry Trenin from the Carnegie Moscow Center. He said if Peter the Great were alive today, he would relocate the capital to Vladivostok, not St. Petersburg. What do you think about that?
I think that's totally right. It's actually symbolic that Putin is spending 3 days in Beijing. He spent less than 24 hours on meeting the EU leaders. He spent less than a day to meet Merkel. He spent less than a day to meet the new French president. But at the same time, I think that the relationship is quite disbalanced. I mean, it is Russia that is trying to court China on a number of issues, to have this good relationship. On the Chinese side, I think that China is much more oriented towards the US and the EU. And actually, whilst they have quite a few common issues when it comes to multilateral cooperation, like the UN Security Council and so on, the bilateral relationship is increasingly more difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, China is now Russia's biggest and most important trade partner. That's definitely not the case from the Chinese perspective. The trade with Russia is quite minimal when it comes to energy resources. I mean, China imports much more energy, be it gas or oil, from the countries like Iran or even Central Asia, not Russia. And that was one of the source of frustrations for Moscow, that they haven't really been able to develop the kind of strong, bold energy partnership or relationship that they tried to develop, partly to scare the Europeans, partly just to diversify the oil exports and gas exports. The other example, for example, is Central Asia, where they sort of shared common interests in terms of security, but when it comes to practical issues, for example, the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which Russia hoped would be the vehicle for Russian influence in the region, is increasingly being taken over by the Chinese. It's the Chinese pushing forward the free trade agreement in the region, which Russians really don't care about. For them, it's about security and about borders and so on. I think Russia has far more expectations from the Chinese than the Chinese from Russians. And last thing on the Far East. It's a big dilemma, isn't it? Because Russians know that Far East development is crucial for Russia's demographic future, Russia's economic future, and so on. But at the same time, they know that it's not going to be the Europeans going to invest lots of money in the region. It's probably going to be the Chinese. But at the same time, the Chinese are primarily interested when it comes to Russia in energy resources and maybe lease of land. You don't really have Chinese building factories in Far East or employing Russian workers to boost the local economy. And that's the dilemma that Russia has. I mean, they don't need to develop the resources. They have the Western companies to do that. The question is, how can the Chinese be helpful in development Far East region at a time when the interests on both sides are not really the same?
Natalia Karpova, I'm looking here for the perspective of an economist based in Moscow. Putin's visit to China, is this a case of keeping your friends close and your enemies closer?
I think that is long-term tradition to keep good relations with China. It doesn't mean that in some periods we have some problems and questions, but generally, strategically, both countries were very much interested to benefit from cooperation with each other. What we have right now, I would like to stretch the point. I think that the Russian political and economic leaders seriously transform their perception and vision of China as just a dynamic eastern partner and neighbor of Russia. And now China is perceived as a serious global player with a lot of opportunities for foreign direct investments with a lot of expertise in different fields, especially in industrial fields. And you know that Russia, as a heavily exporting and heavily importing country, it still has problems to develop its own industrial complex. We could discuss why it is important for Russia and what is the priorities of the current policy of the Russian government. But in any case, for the big country with a lot of population like Russia, the industrial base is extremely important. If we go back to Europe, you know that many forums in Europe now are discussing the revitalization of industrial grounds in Europe in order to cope the social problems and unemployment problems in Europe. So Russia also has quite a lot of questions in the field of industrialization, employment of population. In this case, the experience of China heavily grounding its growth on the share of capital investments in the GDP of the country gives us very good example how to use these industrial drivers for economic development. That's why Russia is becoming more sensitive to the initiatives from the Chinese side, and those initiatives, in my mind, are becoming more and more intensive. Russia has quite a lot of delegations of potential investors in different fields. They're very much interested to go in depth into cooperation in different sectors of the Russian economy. And my feeling that Chinese partners now are quite more active than, say, investors from the Western Europe and other parts of the world. So they're keeping the dominance in trying to put Russia on stage in their investment plans. And if we speak about this situation, generalizing somehow the situation, Russia now acts like a bridge between the interests of the European Union and China to build up a complementary big part of the world economy with the resources of Russia, with the knowledge-based economies of European Union, and very energetic and entrepreneurial type of organization of economy and a very solid industrial base like China. So somehow those visits of President Putin just identified that Russia tries to be this bridging point, and maybe it's not right now on paper of the Russian leaders, but by fact we see that Russia plays a role like a bridging source of European Union and China.
That was Natalia Karpova from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow saying that for economically developing Russia's Far East region, it need look no further than China. I was also joined by John Lough from the Foreign Policy Institute Chatham House, Victor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, and Jana Kobzova from a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update of what's making headlines around the world.